Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar will be on the benefits of Clip Studio Paint over Photoshop. If you could just give it a few seconds, we'll let everyone join in. We have a large pool of attendees. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. Just wanted to let everyone know that we have a few housekeeping items. The webinar itself will be approximately 1 hour long. All attendees will be muted. The Q&A session will be 15 minutes and it will be at the end of the webinar. We recommend all attendees to ask questions right away in the questions area. You'll be able to see it on your user interface for GoToWebinar. And due to time constraints, not all questions will be answered. The webinar will be recorded and it will be shared via social media to the registrants as well as to the attendees. And your panelists today will be myself, Fahim, Joanna from Celsius. She'll be helping with the Q&A session, and of course, our guest of honor, Brian Allen. So just before we get into the webinar, wanted to give you guys some info on Clip Studio Paint. We'll be more or less covering that in depth today. If you wanted some more information on Clip Studio Paint, the all-in-one solution for stunning and amazing comics, illustrations, and manga, I would recommend going to the links that are available on the page that you're seeing right now. And with that, today's webinar will be on the Clip Studio Paint's benefits over Adobe Photoshop, and Brian Allen will be your guest, and he will be the one presenting the webinar. And with that, I'll pass over the reins of the webinar to Brian to start his discussion.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks so much for coming, and thanks so much for having me. Let me share my screen. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, you should be seeing my screen now. My name is Brian Allen. I'm a freelance illustrator. I've been a professional illustrator for 12 years, and I've been a full-time freelancer for 6. And my wife and I run this business called Flyland Designs, and we work with businesses large and small all over the world. Some of the bigger clients we've worked with are down here, Activision, Hulk Hogan, Harley Davidson, Chick-Fil-A, Scholastic, Marvel, and Epson. And I discovered Clip Studio Paint several years ago. I think it was maybe 4. And I used to use Photoshop primarily for everything I did, but I could never really get Photoshop to mimic the way that I ink. And when I found Clip Studio Paint, back then it was Manga Studio 4, it was a total revelation. Like it completely changed the way I work, and it just made everything more enjoyable and my artwork better. So I want to do a really quick run through of my favorite features, and I'm going to move pretty quickly because there's a lot of them, but at the end of the session I'll be happy to take questions and go into more detail. In general, I believe that Clip Studio Paint compared to other programs is faster because it's lighter. It doesn't try to do things that it's not. And it's the best drawing and inking experience that I've had of any software I've tried. And it's also very stable. For whatever reason, I don't experience any crashes compared with other programs. So let me open it up right here. Okay, great. So first thing I wanted to show you really quick, this is kind of a new feature a couple versions ago. They have a new customizable menu, which is really great. It allows you to basically add any shortcuts, tools, or actions that you want. So I've been using this a lot because I really heavily depend on keyboard shortcuts. But now I can put, like, you know, fill, rulers, my favorite ink pens, my favorite pencil, copy, cut, flipping horizontal, that kind of stuff right here in a menu that I can just click on, and that saves a lot of time. The first thing I wanted to cover with Clip Studio Paint that I think is my favorite feature is reference layers. And this is a drawing that I did for Rick and Morty for one of their t-shirts. And what I do as a first step of any illustration is I'll go in and block in all the colors so that the hair, the skin, the eyes, the teeth, they're all separate. And these colors are pretty random. I just select them so that they're different enough so that when I make a selection, it's not selecting things that are touching the other object. When you do this in Photoshop, you would have to continuously select back to that layer. And let's say like I select his face, then I'd have to switch back to my painting layer and paint in there, then switch back to that, then switch to here, and it becomes really cumbersome and it really slows down the process. But with reference layers, what you can do is you turn on this little lighthouse icon right here. And what that does is it is telling the program that it only wants, when you use the wand, it's only going to sample from the information on that layer. So this was the final result, but I would start with something like this, just with like a blue tone. And I'm going to change the wand to this preset here, selection for reference layer. And you want to make sure that these settings are correct. You want it to say not referring to your editing layer. Otherwise, the wand is going to select all of this blue, but we want it to ignore that. So what I'm going to do is I got the wand and I'm going to make it follow adjacent pixel. And now I can go, actually I'm going to turn that off so I can do all the eyeballs at once. So now all the eyeballs are selected, and without even changing my layer, I can just go and start painting them. And that way I don't have to worry about staying within the lines either. So I can move really, really quickly. And I'm just using an airbrush, but you can also just fill these. So you can go and use a reference fill paint bucket, and it essentially does the same thing. Without even making a selection at all, I can just go and click these areas. And this is doing it completely independent of my line art on a separate layer. And I think that's one of my favorite things. So the next thing is that makes Clip Studio Paint unique is being able to paint with transparency. What that does is it effectively just turns your brush into an eraser. But unlike other programs, when you switch to the eraser tool, that might be like a really big, giant, soft airbrush. What this does is it just turns your current tool into an eraser. And this is incredibly handy when I'm inking, because a lot of times what I'll do is start with, I'll just like throw in some black, and then I'll go, and you can touch the transparency icon right here, and I can just start, you can start like carving away at things. And I'll also use it for, let's say I'm drawing a line, but I don't like how that line turned out. I can just quickly switch by pressing one keystroke and kind of carve the line to how I want it. And I use that so constantly that anytime I switch to another program, I'm always trying to hit that button. In Photoshop, I used to work in black and white. So you would have a flat white layer and you'd be drawing black and switching back between those two colors. But the disadvantage of that is that it's not a fully transparent layer. So in the end, you're still going to have to extract your black line art from that white background. And that can lead to some issues and like some pixelation too. Oh, and I should say that painting with transparency works with anything. It works with any soft airbrush, textured airbrush. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be an inking tool. All right, so these are some helicopter zombies. Having a good time here. This was created for a t-shirt, and my client said he loved it, but we realized, and this sometimes happens when you're silk screening, that we're using too many colors. He can only use, I think it was 4, and I had used 5 or 6. So what I'm going to have to do is turn one of these colors, take this blue, into a halftone of black. One of the amazing things about Clip Studio Paint is that you can actually use halftone layers, and they are live editable layers that you can throw any type of brush on. A soft brush, a hard brush, it doesn't matter, and it will convert them to halftones, and you can change them at any time. And I'll show you how that's done. But I do a ton of t-shirts for my job, and probably too many. And I use this primarily. I will do a full step in Clip Studio Paint and then send that to a t-shirt printer, and the results are fantastic. So let's zoom in here. So I have this dark blue color all on its own layer. That's typically how I do t-shirts, is I like to keep each layer, or each color rather, separated, because that helps the printing process. And I should say, if you're not familiar with silk screening, they have to lay down one color at a time. So let's actually, that'd be a good exercise. Let me just show you how this is pieced together. So we have a black background, black shirt, blue, dark blue, orange, yellow, red, and then this line art will either be silk screened or subtracted from all of the artwork there. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this blue layer, and we're going to go up here to the layer property menu. And in there, if you just click this halftone pattern thing, there's a whole menu here, and it gives us tons of cool options. We can change the shape of this to circles, squares, all kinds of things. This is one of my favorites here, the line. And it looks a little funky, but when you zoom out, the t-shirt is actually probably going to be printed about this size, right? Those lines won't be visible on the fabric. So what you get is that will be printed as black, but it will give you the impression of another color. So we're not finished here. So what I do is first I convert that to the halftone, and you can change the LPI here. We'll go with like 42.
Excuse me,
And
Brian, if I
then,
may interrupt.
yeah, go
Apologies for
ahead.
that. We're getting some feedback from users that the screen is showing very slowly. Is it possible for you to turn off your cam? I think we're going to probably have to turn that off in order to speed up the visibility of the screen.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Does that work any better?
We'll let you know in a few minutes.
All right, great. So I'm just panning the screen back and forth.
Perfect.
So
It looks much better.
the
It's looking much better.
great. So what I'll do here is, once this is done, I will rasterize this. First, what you got to do is change. I forgot about that. Change this to using the brightness of the image, the brightness of that layer. So then you'll see that it's making that transparent. And once you get something you like, then you can rasterize it. And now this is ready for print. This would just be printed black, but when we zoom out, you can see that it has that mid-tone that we were looking for. And this is very useful because no other program I've come across will allow you to do this. The only one that comes close is Photoshop, but unfortunately in Photoshop, you would have to export that layer into a different file, save it as a bitmap, convert it to a halftone, and then bring it, cut it, and paste it back into your image. Now, if you're doing that with like several halftone layers stacked on top of each other, it becomes a mess. And the best thing is too, as I said, these are still editable. So if your silkscreen shop calls you and says, hey, you know, I know we told you 42.5 LPI, but we meant 30, you can go back and change that just like that. All right, this is a relatively new feature called, where is it? It's the contour, let me get it right, contour line paint tool. And at first, I really wasn't real sure how to use it, but once I figured it out, I'm using this quite frequently. It's really cool. So here's an illustration here that I want to color these eyeballs, and I want to make them look three-dimensional by making it kind of brighter in the center, darker around the edge, and then with a rim light around the edge of that. So I could just get an airbrush in here, but if I want to do things really precisely, what I'm going to do, I've got these on a different layer. I'm going to get an ink pen, and this is important. It has to be set to anti-aliased right here. So you need the hardest edge possible. And I'm going to grab a really light color, and none of what I'm going to do is going to make sense at first, so just bear with me. So first I'm going to draw a circle around the pupil, and then I'll draw another circle right there. And then we want to draw that rim light. All right, cool. And then we're going to choose a color that's slightly darker. That looks good. That's probably a little too dark. All right. Good. So we want to decide where the midpoint is going to be, and I'm just going to say it's going to be around here. And then we get this tool out, and it doesn't matter what color you have selected. And what you want to do is make sure that you have, let's see, I have do not cover transparency. We want that. And you can change your gradient here, but we're going to leave that at the default. Now, when I click in here, what it's going to do is it's basically averaging those colors. So it's taking that brown line and then making it a gradient into that lighter color, and the same here. And what you get is like a really quick rendering effect. But you can also use it, what I use it for a lot is when I want to make backgrounds that have gradients of multiple colors, but I want them to be like really flowy and have interesting curves, I guess. And you can customize them just like that. And I thought that was a really cool tool. All right, now I want to show you something called file objects. If you've ever used smart objects in Photoshop, it's a little similar to the way that they work. I don't know if this is a recent addition to Clip Studio Paint, but I kind of found out about it recently, and I thought it was really, really cool. So what I'm going to do, I have a set of custom brushes that I sell on my website here. So we're going to use one of these. I'm going to find a leaf. Great. So what I want to do is add some leaves behind this logo. Okay, so I have a leaf, right? What I can do is go to the menu, or the layer menu right here, and right click and say File Object, Convert Layer to File Object. And you want to do the drawing area, not the canvas size. So you say OK, and it's going to ask you to save this. So sure, I'll save it. Ignore that. And now you'll see that your leaf file has this little arrow shortcut icon with the page. So whenever I duplicate this, we're creating another instance of that symbol. It's really similar to using the symbol menu in Adobe Illustrator, if you have. What's fantastic about this is that, and I'll show you an example in a second, it doesn't matter how many times I copy this, and it doesn't matter how many times I shrink it or expand it, it'll never get pixelated as long as I don't make it bigger than its original size. But I'm about to show you, once I get these leaves in position, I'll show you why this is so cool. All right, let's make another leaf. And if you want, you can even like lower the opacity of some of these. Now, let's say I did this, but I decided I didn't like the color. Well, rather than start that whole process over or individually change the color of each one, I can just right click and say, where are you? File object, and then open file of file object. And now what I can do is edit this directly. Let's say I want to get kind of like a, oops, kind of more of a gradient effect there. And then let's say we want to accentuate these. Let's do something real quick. All right, if I save that and then we go back to the original file, it changes all of the leaves that were linked to that file. So this is incredibly helpful. For example, I just did a map for an amusement park, and we had tons and tons of little trees everywhere. So I just made one file object of one tree, repeated it, and there were a couple times where I realized, you know what, that tree needs like a stroke on it, or that tree needs to be a different color. And I changed that one, and it changed all of them in the whole document. So very cool. All right, another thing that sets Clip Studio Paint apart in terms of inking are its vector layers. And the only drawback is that you cannot export these as a vector file, as like an EPS or AI file, but they behave exactly like you would expect vectors to behave. So let me show you how I use them here. This is really cool. So if I get an ink brush, let's use this guy. Vector layers do kind of smooth out your line work a little bit, but you can adjust that if you think it's smoothing it too much. I kind of am not a fan of too much smoothing. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to ink these lines, and I'm not going to pay attention to actually closing the lines. So I'm going to intentionally make them overlap. So what's so great about the vector layers is that you can get out the vector eraser here. And now I can go in and click on the overlapping part, and through some kind of witchcraft, it knows what to delete. So this is a huge time saver for pretty much exactly that purpose when I'm doing outlines for like things that come to a fine point. Now, just like any other vector, you can get out the object selection tool here, and we can now mess with our line art like this. And there are a whole slew of vector editing tools too, like this thing. I find when I'm inking, I actually don't use these a lot to edit my lines. I find it's quicker sometimes just to redraw it, but the option is here for you, and it works really well, I think. Now, the other benefit, of course, of using vectors is that you can infinitely resize things. So if you take this guy's pupil, for example, this one is a raster graphic, and it's not a vector. So if I need to resize this pupil, you're going to see that there's going to be all kinds of nasty jagginess and bit mapping, which is no good. This pupil, on the other hand, was created on a vector layer, and I can resize it infinitely, and it will remain forever sharp. Pretty cool. And what's great about vector layers in Clip Studio Paint as well is that it's not just for inking brushes. You can use it for anything. You can use it for pattern brushes, like this barbed wire, and then you can go in, grab it, grab a control point, and move it around. You can also do the same thing, and I'm not sure even how it does this, but you can do the same thing with a soft brush, and that's a vector. So very cool. All right, moving on to 3D objects. Um, Clip Studio Paint has a huge library of 3D objects to choose from, but you can also export .obj files anywhere you find on the web. And Photoshop also has a way to mess with 3D objects, but I find that this interface is far quicker, more intuitive, and it's also great because you can work with the 3D object directly on your illustration. So let me show you how I would do that in this case. So I drew this illustration for a guy's monster truck, and when I showed it to him, he thought that he should be holding a monkey wrench. So that's pretty clever, I guess. But what I'll do is I'll take out the wrench like this. Now, monkey wrenches are pretty hard to draw, especially at the angle that this guy is holding it. So what I'm going to do is I found a cool wrench file that somebody had rendered in 3D. And all you got to do is drag it directly onto the canvas. And once it's here, you can rotate it, resize it. Oop, come on now. Sorry, trying to find the rotate button. Come on, don't embarrass me in front of my friends. Here we go. So, where the heck are you? Well, here was one that I actually put into position after playing with it for a little while. And once I had that down, then what I did was I traced over it, and then I applied a threshold effect, and the threshold effects are all up here so that it actually just sort of traced it for me. And then I would go back in with my ink brush and like clean this up and add a little bit of style to it. But Clip Studio Paint also has a huge library of these mannequins that you can pose. So what I did was I dropped this in here. Here we go. And every point is completely articulated. So you can come in here and move these mannequins around to get this pose was really challenging. So this really helped me figure out how that hand was going to come at you, and the legs foreshortening and everything like that. You can find all of these over here in the materials section. There's a whole drop down of 3D objects that come with the program, and they have a huge asset library as well. And once you find what you want, you just simply drag it in there, and there you go. Okay, great. So one of my favorite things about Clip Studio Paint is the ability to create brushes with full color and repeatable patterns in them. The Photoshop brush engine, of course, is really powerful, but all of its brushes are only black and white. I prefer the Adobe Illustrator brush engine, where you can actually create repeatable patterns that have full color. And you can do that right here in Clip Studio Paint. So I have a whole series of pattern brushes that I created. And let's get one here I made of an illustrated rope. And what we're going to do is we want to put a rope belt around this guy's waist. So I'm going to find, where are you? I have too many brushes. Okay, here we go. And the foreground color is going to be the line art value, and the secondary color is going to be the fill. So let's do something like this. Great. And I'm going to put this on a vector layer so that we can control it later if we need to. So I'm just going to draw here. And I have a longer video on my YouTube channel of how to actually create these brushes. I'm not going to go into depth now, but it is surprisingly easy. And you can do it with any repeatable pattern or really just any graphic that you find at all. So then once we have that, I'll go in and erase part of it. There we go. And because it's on a vector layer, if I think I need to adjust it a little bit, instead of redrawing it, I can just grab one of these tools and mess around with it that way. So if we need to pinch this a little bit. And I'm doing this just by holding, is it command or control? Yeah, command. Now, sorry, I use keyboard shortcuts a lot, so sometimes I don't even know what I'm pressing. But it's the object selector tool, and you'll just draw a box around it, and then you can move all of these points around. All right, I want to show you a little bit of the rulers in Clip Studio Paint. It's incredibly powerful, and I don't have enough time to really go into all of them in detail, but this is one thing that sets it apart as well from any graphics program I've used. Photoshop and Sketchbook Pro, they do have symmetry rulers, but unfortunately with their symmetry rulers, they only work with paintbrushes and some other tools. In Clip Studio Paint, if you draw a symmetry line, every single tool you use, lassos, erasers, smudge tools, will repeat on the other side. This is incredibly useful because I often use a technique, comic book coloring technique, where you will, so I have a symmetry line here. Let me just show you how it works. If you go to ruler and you choose symmetrical ruler, we're going to do 2 lines here. And we'll get like a green color. Great. And so now when I draw, it's going to be drawing on both sides. But as I said, you can get the lasso tool out, draw a cut, and fill it on both sides, something that you can't do in any other program. It's really helpful. And what's great about the symmetry brush tool is that you can do, I think, up to 16 lines of symmetry. So I do this sometimes when I need to create like abstract backgrounds. So let's throw that here. And I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen, but there's like a lot of pink lines shooting down here. And you can make some really cool like mandala effects here and abstract patterns really fast. And the performance of this is great. Like it doesn't slow this down at all. And this is a pretty big image. So that's really useful. Let's get rid of that. The radial line symmetry brush is something I use constantly. This will allow you to make a focus point, and then everything you draw will go towards that point. So that's up here in ruler, and then you're going to be selecting special ruler and radial line. So I'm going to put it here, and now you just start throwing lines, and they all converge at that point. It's great for making burst effects and that kind of stuff. The curve line works a lot like that, but it's like a line that you can curve and shape how you want. So everything I throw is following this curve that I drew, but converging at that one point. All right, and then the concentric circles ruler is fantastic. Just go into rulers, special ruler, concentric circle. And I put one of these rulers right at the pupil of his eye. So any line that I draw is going to follow that same circle. And you can make that an ellipse. And what's great about this, like if I wanted to achieve something like this in Photoshop, I would probably have to just draw this circle and then copy and paste it and resize it over and over again. But I can just do effects like this really, really fast and control the line width as I throw the line. And of course, this works with any brush, so you can do soft brushes as well. And parallel line is similar. This is really handy when drawing beams of light, or like when you're doing architectural drawings. So any stroke I make will follow the parallel line, the vertical line that I threw down. All right, and lastly, the ruler pen is really great. What this does is it allows you to draw your own ruler. So if you go here and find ruler pen, I'm going to turn the stabilization way up. It's at like 60. And now what I'm going to do is draw just like a loopy curve. And then I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen, but you'll see like a pink line here. And if you ever want to edit it, all you got to do is get out that object selector tool and grab it. And you can select multiple points, or you can just tweak it as a whole. So now when I draw, it's going to follow that line precisely. But what's nice is I can now take my time and then control my line weight as I go. Because sometimes when you have to think about the curve of your line, but also the line weight at the same time, it doesn't give you as much control. But this is fantastic. And you can even do it with really complex objects too. So I've had items that I wanted to repeat. Let's say if I was going to repeat this pattern on his armlet here. If I want to draw it in another place, but I want the line art to be a little bit different so it doesn't look so mechanical, I would make that into a ruler with the ruler pen, copy it, and just redraw it. So all the shapes are basically the same. It's just has enough uniqueness to not look like an exact copy. All right, here's our man Gritty. So another great thing about Clip Studio Paint is the Smart Magic Wand and the Smart Paint Bucket. In Photoshop, I used to never use those tools because I felt like they just worked very poorly. They didn't give you any control over what you were selecting really beyond just a few things. But in Clip Studio Paint, there are a ton of really cool options, and so I use them all the time, especially when coloring something like this that has really clean line art. So let me show you here. The goal here is that I am going to want to fill this area here on his sleeve. But you can see that I accidentally didn't close this line. Sometimes that's an accident, but sometimes you do that for effect rather than having a complete line. It kind of makes the weight look lighter. So what I've done is I've taken the ink layer, which is right here, and I've made that a reference layer by selecting the lighthouse. And when I go to the colors layer, I'm going to grab the reference layer wand. And one of the challenges that I sometimes experience when coloring things based on line art in other programs is that you often get like a halo. The color will go right up to the line, but it won't quite go there because some of it is aliased, right? So then you get like this white ghosted edge around everything. So often when you're coloring, especially when you're flatting, you want that selection to expand. Well, in Photoshop, I would have to make the selection and then go to Edit, Select, Expand. But here they have an option built in to scale your selection. So I'm going to turn that to, let's say, like 3 pixels. And I'm going to zoom way in here. So when I make the selection, you can see that it actually grows under the line art by 3 pixels. This is incredibly useful when doing t-shirt designs because when setting up silk screening, you want a little bit of that trapping to be underneath the line art. So just in case the screens shift even the tiniest bit. Now the second thing you'll notice is that I turned on this close gap feature. If that wasn't on, our selection is going to escape this section here and try to select everything. Now in Photoshop, over and over again, I would do that selection and it would spill out and I'd have to zoom in and figure out where I made a mistake. But now I can do close gap and it will intelligently know that a gap of that amount is a complete line. And that's incredibly helpful. So then I can go in and fill that. And you can do the same exact thing with the paint bucket tool if you'd rather not even make a selection. So I'm going to do the reference fill bucket. Make sure it's selected here as multiple referencing. You want it to be referencing the reference layer. Turn on not referring to the editing layer. And I'm going to do area scaling to like 3. And there we go. So I can very quickly go around here and kind of fill in areas. And again, I'm not working on my line art area at all. It's just referencing the information there, because so you can turn off the line art and see what's happening. So I can do this really quickly and clean up any mistakes that I need to when I'm done. Another great thing about Clip Studio Paint is the mesh transformation tool. It's a lot like the liquify tool in Photoshop, but the great difference is I can warp many different layers at once. With the liquify tool, you can only do one. So let me show you here. I've got this rat and he's broken up into many different layers. And I want to keep those layers because there's some good stuff here. So what I'm going to do is go to Edit, Transform, Mesh Transformation. And then it's going to throw this grid on us. You can go over here in the tool property menu and add all these control points to it. The more control points, the more things you can move around. So let's just do the max. And I just want to real subtly go in and like make some tiny little changes. This might slow things down a little bit, but I want to bring that tail over here. I want to bring this foot down here just a little bit. There we go. And bring that ear out. And there we go. So you can see what we've done. Now, again, that would be impossible using the liquify tool without first merging all of your layers. What's great, and I've done this before on another project, Clip Studio Paint has an entire animation studio built in here. You can bring the timeline up, and you can take an illustration and kind of mesh warp parts of it, take a screenshot of it, add it here down into the timeline, do that again, put it in the timeline, and then tween some frames in between. And it's a really quick way to make an animation. All right, so this is, oh yeah, let me show you the gradient tools because there's something really cool in Clip Studio Paint, the way it handles gradients. You can actually make live editable gradient layers. And what that means is I can throw a gradient down, but it will be forever editable. And let me show you what I mean. So what you're going to want to do is change this here to, instead of draw on editing layer, you say create gradient layer. All right. So what we want to do is we want to put like kind of a, let's see. Let's do like a purple, like this. All right, so I'm going to throw this gradient. And what that has done is it's given me a gradient layer here that I can edit. And so the way to do that is you'll select the object selector tool. And now I can go here and add colors, move around the like space or how, how much each color takes up. Let's add like a yellow. There we go. And this is really great because this will also never lose its size. It acts like a vector layer. So if I take this into another document, it's not going to pixelate. And I can always come back and add new layers or just fine tune it like that. Real quick, I wanted to show you how I use the subview menu, which is something that no other program has that I'm aware of. So if you go to Window and Subview, that's going to bring up this little palette here that looks a little bit like the navigator. What I do here is I will grab a color palette and you can drag it right into this document here, or this document window, sorry. And whenever you hover your cursor over this subview menu, it automatically turns into an eyedropper. You don't even have to press a button. So when I was working on this illustration this was for Chick-Fil-A, and everything was great, but they gave me a very specific red to use. So they sent me this here, and I can just pull that up and add the red. And what I'll do too is, like, when I'm working, if I find cool palettes, I'll just store them in here. And for me, it's a little easier than working with swatches because it's much bigger and I can store many of them and just flick between them real quick by pressing these cursor buttons. It's also fantastic when you're working on an illustration series. I do a lot of children's book illustrations, and what I will do is open up the one character in the subview menu on every page they're located in, and it's basically just a preview. It's different than having the entire document open because it doesn't use as many of your computer's resources. Then I can just flip through whenever I need reference of that character, and when I'm coloring them, I can just really quickly sample from every, make sure their shirt is the same color on every page. All right, another one of my favorite tools is the lasso fill tool. Now you can find this because I've been asked this a lot. It's in the direct draw. And this is where the rectangle and the ellipse and the straight line are. This just looks like a regular lasso, but what it does is as soon as you throw a line, it fills it with your foreground color. So essentially it's the same as drawing a selection and then filling it and then deselecting, but it does it much quicker and without those other steps. So I find this thing incredibly useful when I'm inking because sometimes you want to throw some strokes that aren't as like mechanical or don't look like brush strokes. So what I'll do is just really quickly, to add texture, just go in and draw some shapes like this. And it's a really nice way to get, some blobs and shapes that you wouldn't normally draw. All right, great. So that's all I had. I would love to answer some questions if you have any, or if I went too fast past something, I can go back and explain a little more.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Brian. Joanna, if you have any questions, it would be great to ask Brian right now.
Yes. So for one, I apologize for the lag that a lot of you are experiencing. This is a first. So, but anyway, I hope this all was very helpful. So I would like to ask Brian some questions about that you all have been asking. We'll do as many as we can. So, let's start with some setup related questions. Brian, what kind of
Sure.
graphic tablet are you using? And what is your configuration for tablet and keyboard and mouse and everything?
Sure. I've been using, well, currently I'm using the Wacom Cintiq Pro 24 inch. I got that back in April, but before that I had been using the older Wacom Cintiq for maybe like 7 years. Um, I love it, especially the new one. It's amazing. And if you're interested, I have a YouTube review of it on my channel. I would recommend, because I do get asked this question a lot. If you're serious about digital illustration, um, it is worth at least trying a display tablet. Um, I used to use the Wacom tablets, that lay flat on a desk and you're looking at your monitor, but I always had a problem with the disconnect between your hand and the screen. I find it so much faster and better to draw directly on the screen. Now it's expensive, but if you're doing it professionally, I think it will pay for itself really quick. And as far as the keyboard setup, I'm using all kinds of things. I have a keyboard or a keypad that was designed for gamers called a Razer. I think it's called like the Orbitron or something like Orb Weaver. It's the Razer Orb Weaver. And it was designed for like people playing games for hours to be able to real quickly press keyboard shortcuts and macros. And I've programmed all of like my favorite tools and actions and things like that. So what's great is usually when I'm working, I don't need to touch the keyboard at all. I just have my left hand on this keypad and my right hand on the pen. Um, and yeah, I think, does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Just let me check. There are a few questions about shortcuts and setups. So,
Sure.
just a second. Mm, 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 mm.
Well,
Oh,
yeah, and while you're getting it,
yes, sorry.
I'll show you where you would change your shortcuts. Maybe what
Oh
I can
yeah,
do in the
that's it.
future, I could
Yes.
like maybe provide how I set up all my shortcuts. But I should say like that's one thing I love. Another thing I guess I love about Clip Studio Paint is that it gives you more control over your shortcuts than any other program I've come across. You can control literally anything really. Um, so there's actually a couple different places. One of them is going to be in the menu up here in shortcut settings. The other one would be modifier key settings. So let's start with shortcut settings. These are going to be all the things that you can control for your tools, your options. You can assign a keyboard shortcut to any of your actions that you set up. Um, so let me show you one that I use all the time. Currently, oh, it would be option. So I like to have X switch back and forth between drawing and a transparent color. I think by default that switches between your main and sub color, but I use that much more. So all you got to do is just come in here and click on this and you can change it to whatever you want. The other menu option, the modifier key settings, is also really cool because you can go in and change any of these tools to make it do something when you hold like here, like option shift. I can make that change the brush size when I'm using this other tool. And you can do this specifically for every single tool there is in Clip Studio Paint. So one thing that I've set up is that whenever I'm using a drawing tool like the pen, I have it so that if I hold, I don't know, maybe it's Command Control, um, that will bring up the object selector tool, and that allows me to really quickly like throw a shape down and then switch to that tool by holding those buttons, and then transform it. Um, if that makes sense.
Yes. Okay, so the other shortcut one was specifically about the preset colors. Like, where do you find those and the palettes in
Oh yeah.
general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I get this a lot. Any like swatch palettes that you find that work in Photoshop will also work here. Uh, all you'll have to do is either drag the file directly into this menu, or you can go to import color set. The one that I'm using currently, I believe, was something by the artist Alex Ducal. He's a really talented artist, and he was giving it away for free. So I really like my current or his current swatches because there's actually not that many colors here. It kind of has every color of the rainbow, but only a few tones. And this sort of limits me so that I'm not picking just off the wall colors, which I think is important. Because when you go to the art store and you buy like a watercolor palette, there's usually only, maybe 9 swatches in there, and you should be able to use all of those swatches to paint just about anything. Um, as far as where to get other palettes, I would just do a Google search or maybe search DeviantArt because I know a lot of people make those available. Oh yeah, and real quick too, this giant, enormous palette here is just my color history. And this was introduced a few years ago, and it's fantastic because every single color I use is saved in here. And I can go back and select the color that I used, 2 documents ago. And I think Photoshop has this, but they only save like 12 colors. This thing saves saves them all. So it's really useful.
Okay, remaining with the color theme. Here's a question regarding your workflow. You use very vibrant colors, and they're always balanced and never overdone or too busy. How do you usually organize your coloring process in terms of steps and layers?
Well, I appreciate that. I feel like coloring is the most difficult stage for me. I don't know. I mean, because I feel like my coloring is very chaotic. But this is a good piece to look at because there's a lot happening here, right? Maybe too much. But what I like to do, and I kind of showed it here, is when I start coloring, I make everything like one color, and I usually start with a low saturated blue, and then find out which colors you know are going to have to be in here. So for example, if we know that Rick's shirt has to be blue, I'm going to start with that. And then I start to pick colors, sometimes from this palette. Sometimes I'll just use the eyedropper tool like this, grab this blue, and then, maybe move it a little bit towards the green so that the colors aren't too drastically different from each other, and add that somewhere else. I think you also saw me, rather than, here, let me grab this. Bear with me one second. Let me get this. So rather than try to pick the color and fill it like this, what I like to do is get the soft airbrush and like gradually put the color on. So that way, as I'm coloring, I can see kind of like, okay, good, that's too much maybe, and then I'll maybe add a little bit of yellow like this or something like that. Because trying to pick the color from the wheel or from a swatch and hope it's right is kind of a guessing game that you're never going to win. You kind of want to pick your colors on the canvas, if that makes sense. And I'm sorry, it's difficult to give like a real specific answer on that. I guess just practice, and I guess also trying to get inspiration from a lot of artists. I have a lot of folders with really great color schemes that I find, so I think it's important to collect those over time, because that also forces you to try new color schemes that you might never have tried.
Okay. Here's another question. What are your main inking brushes for the pieces you have shown today? Apparently from someone who has purchased all of your brush packs.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I do sell these on my website, but I also use a lot. Here, I'll show you. So I use a lot of the default brushes. I think the G pen and the mapping pen are great. Those come with the software. The G pen especially is great for cartooning where you need like a really smooth, predictable, dependable line. Other than that, I use this brush called the Pencil MS4 brush, which was created from something that I converted over from Manga Studio 4. And then I also use Ray Frendon. He has a great brush series. So I use some of his. And I also really like this square tip. I use this a lot. It's a brush I made that, here, and I'll show you what that looks like when you go into the settings. It's just a square. It's a square, and then I played around with the curve a little bit. And what this does is it gives my line work, it gives my line work a little bit of style to it and edge like right away, because it's not a perfect circle. So I find that really useful.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's finish off with one more question. How long did it take you to adjust to using Clip Studio for your work instead of Photoshop?
You know, not long at all, because I actually found them to be really similar. Um, I've talked with artists who are going from, like, let's say Sketchbook Pro or Corel Painter to here, and there's a little bit more of a learning curve. I think the thing that took the longest to figure out was how to make the brushes, because there's so many more options in this program that it's sort of overwhelming at first to figure out how to do it. But there are lots of videos online on how to do it, and once you learn it, it's amazing what you can do. It's pretty limitless. Other than that, most of the keyboard shortcuts are exactly the same, and the ones that aren't, I ended up just changing myself so that I didn't even have to relearn that. The layers and the filters are generally the same. The What else? Um, yeah, everything else is just sort of learning the new tools, but there's a lot of resources for that, so it didn't take too long.
Okay, thank you very much. That's all the questions I have for today.
Hey, great. And if I could just say, for the webinar, I'm giving a free set of actions. If you just go to my web shop, which is flylanddesigns.com shop, anybody can download those. And the actions are just things that I do when I set up a new document. There'll be things, I can show you really quickly, I guess, but they will just set up a new set of layers and a new set of guides, and other tricks that I find useful. So if you're interested in that, you can download those for free. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Brian. And with that, we're concluding the webinar. I wanted to also take a moment to thank all the attendees. We had quite a large turnout. Apologies for the bit of delay that we had on the screen, but hopefully towards the end things got better. If you want to know more about Clip Studio Paint, please make sure to go to graphicsly.com as well as clipstudio.net/en. As well, if you want to know more about Brian Allen, please go to flylanddesigns.com. And once again, from all of us at Graphicsly, Celsius, Flyland Designs, thank you so much for your time, and we'll talk to you soon, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.